Welcome to the building of Pomme Fantaisie. This is a co-op two-player heist game with a top-down style, which was influenced by games like Hitman and Payday 2, but minus the combat. I wanted to create a more casual experience that was reminiscent of the good old days of split screen. And after filling out the map a bit, I started work on player movement. Just some basic stuff at first, and then moved on to a main camera which follows around the two players. Now if the players were to go two separate sides of the camera would split off into two, like some old Star Wars games used to do. This would allow the players to work on their own, however the larger camera view gives them an advantage when working together. Animation part 1 here. Animation was a bit of an arse for some reason. I couldn't get legacy clips to work, so I had to manually. At this point in animation, I'm mostly prioritizing functionality over anything fancy. So later on you'll see I use blend trees, which are far more efficient than these horrorscapes I'm creating at the moment. Next up with the cameras. These are a fun one. So was the guard, to be fair. They use two things. They use a raycast and they use a trigger. At first, I only used a raycast, and as the game was starting to flesh out a bit more, I decided to add a trigger that tells the camera or the guard to raycast towards the player. And here, very briefly, you get to see Pain Incarnate, also known as trying to fix the legacy clips. I went through the classic Costas troubleshooting, to no avail, alas. So later on, well, at this point I just give up and move on to something more productive. But later on I choose to use animators with public variables inside them, which I change programmatically instead. And now I'm starting to add some proper AI into the game. The guard has a set path to follow with a number of nodes around the map. And if you are caught within the field of view, he will start to chase you. This didn't work so well towards the end. He would run into things frequently, and he was a tad buggy, to be honest. But he was functional, and he would trigger the alarms, and he would have a nice little icon above his head, as you saw there. At this point I was just trying to figure out raycasting. I had an issue where the guard wouldn't raycast from himself to the player. He would go off at some funny angle, but I fixed that with a bit of good old maths. And here I added a layer mask so that he couldn't see the player through a door or through a wall. Now that the guard and the cameras are working, I decided to rework effectively the alarm system. So instead of working locally, there is a game manager variable that manages the alarm state at any given moment. Once I was comfortable with the skill checks for player 1, I started to add player 2's. There is an alarm that you can turn off, so the display doesn't activate it, and there is the camera console, which turns off all the cameras. And here is just a very basic navigation logic for the end game. And now for my post-review changes. I got plenty of lovely feedback from the class, but most of the changes revolved around adding some UI into the game, zooming out the camera a little bit, and getting some sleep maybe. So I figured I could do 2 of the 3 probably. So I started with implementing some new backdrops for the end screens after blocking out the scenes previously, and adding some customized text to each end screen. Additionally, I started to add some player input UI into the main menu to indicate which player was who. So at the start of the game you have to press X and it highlights your player. And then I went into adding some more icons to the UI to make it clearer what the second player is able to do. Then, as per Costas' request, I added the tutorial screen. It's a pause menu that the player can get up at any time, and it shows all the game's mechanics and teaches you a bit about the game before you start playing as well. And in case you didn't catch it at the end here, I zoomed out the cameras and adjusted them a bit. And now it's about time I show you some actual gameplay. So straight off the bat, I decided to add a tutorial page in, a menu that the player can access any moment in the game. Here I'm going to do a quick run of a failed mission. As you can see, the second player triggered the cameras, which set off the alarm, and he was caught by the guard. And here's my new fancy endgame screen. Next we have probably the cleanest run I've had. In here I try to show off all of the mechanics that I missed out on with the quote-unquote intentional failed run. The cameras here, and the guard for that matter, work in the same way. So they use 2 mechanics. They use a raycast, and they use the triangle as a trigger. So if the player enters the triangle, it will tell the camera or guard to start raycasting towards the player, and if it hits them, it sets off the alarm. Otherwise they're good to go. So using cover is a perfectly valid way of sneaking around the map. Here we have the player 1's lockpicking ability, and he can do that on doors and the vent at the top. And in the top left now we have the hacker disabling the cameras, and in a second he is going to go through the vent and disable the alarm. You'll also notice that the icons either change colour or the padlock changes to open to show that the player has successfully interacted with the item and provide some visual feedback to their actions. And now, with La Pomme Fantaisie in hand, it's time for the players to make a getaway. You'll have to excuse the attempting to do 2 controllers at once. It's a bit iffy. And as per the win conditions, both players have to make it back to the van. And we have our lovely new screen here. And that's La Pomme Fantaisie.